Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the latest installation of the Academia SG Junior Scholar Seminar. We're very happy today to have Goh Wei Hao, who will be speaking with us about street art, right? Something that I think people don't necessarily associate with Singapore that closely, but he's in particular talking about street art in the 1980s, which is, I suppose, a bit jarring to some folks who think or who remember the 1980s as being a much more controlled time. And as discussed today, we have my very good friend, Shumei Huang from the National Taiwan University, who will speak after Wei Hao. So how the proceedings will go is that Wei Hao will talk for about 25 minutes to about half an hour, and Shumei will give her comments from about 5 to 7 minutes. After that, we'll have a Q&A. We will collect your questions online in the chat, and we can take it from there. And I guess this is the live bit. All of this will be recorded and streamed later on the Academia SG Facebook and website. Okay, so we only have 1 hour, so I'm not going to waste time. I would like to turn things over to Wei Hao from King's College. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Ian. Okay, let me share my slides. 1 second. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, this book just now. Okay. Let me share my slides. Okay, good evening, everyone. So my name is Wei Hao, and today I'll be sharing with you more about a project I've been working on, bringing performance to the streets of 1980s Singapore in Art Commandos. So before I begin, I would like to thank all of you for attending, and I look forward to hearing any feedback and questions that you might have. And I also like to thank Professor Shumei for agreeing to be the discussant, Professor Ian for chairing this session, and to Academia SG team for giving me this amazing platform to share my work. But before that, let me just very briefly introduce myself. I'm a final year PhD candidate at King's College London, and I work primarily on contemporary art in Singapore as well as China, with a focus on performance art. So this project is an ongoing research into performance art from the 1980s and 1990s Singapore. It's actually from my past projects that I got the opportunity to meet the artist Jiu Marceau and learned about Art Commandos, which he played a big part in helping to conceptualize and organize. He was also the one who provided me with most of the archival materials. So a big shout out to Jiu. So here is a brief outline of what I will be discussing today. I will start with an introduction of Art Commandos, followed by my research aims and contributions, and the theoretical framework that I will be starting this project with. I will then set the scene by giving a very brief description of 1980s Singapore before I present some findings and analysis and conclude with the next steps that I hope to take with this project. So what exactly is Art Commandos? Art Commandos is a month-long performance event comprising of a series of public performances in multiple sites across Singapore, including Sentosa, Orchard Road, Raffles Place, Toa Payoh, and Newton Food Centre. So the term Art Commandos is also used to refer to the performers and organizers of the event, made up of 22 students who were enlisted from LaSalle College of the Arts, Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts, and the now defunct Baharuddin Vocation Institute. So the event was organized for the 1988 Festival Fringe, which was part of the Singapore Festival of the Arts. According to Arun Mahizan, who played a huge role in conceptualizing and securing the funding for the first few iterations of the Singapore Festival of the Arts, the Fringe Festival was created with the goal of bringing the arts to the people. So this was to complement the Festival of the Arts. This is demonstrated by the fact that there were more than 200 performances at 90 public venues in Singapore. This version of the Singapore Festival of the Arts, as well as several iterations before and after 1988, was chaired by Jessica Leo, who Jiu attributed the success of the Fringe Festival, as well as the Art Commandos, to her vision and support. So, okay, sorry about the slides. It's not great. I realize that some parts of the text is blurred out. But don't worry, the text isn't that important. But anyway, Art Commandos described their mission as offering a unique experience for young artists to combine three different art forms: dance, music, and visual arts, and more importantly, using everyday objects. So the result of this experience will be presented by the Art Commandos at various venues during the weekends of the festival Fringe. So Art Commandos was broken up into different operations. So basically it began with a week-long training camp in Sentosa, which is followed by Operation Evolutionary Sculpture, where they perform and continue developing their performance artwork across various sites in Orchard. Next is Operation Journey into Fun, where they brought the performance to other locations around Singapore, including the Heartlands. The performance event concluded with a final operation at the Old St. Joseph Institute, which houses the Singapore Art Museum today, where they showcase all the performances, performance installations, and documentations that they had created. So next, I will share with you the goals and contributions that I hope to achieve with my research. Basically, through an examination of Art Commandos, I plan to look at how it transformed the perceptions of performance artworks from an art form that is perceived as being foreign into one that can be integrated into the public spaces and consciousness in Singapore. This is achieved by looking at the different ways that Art Commandos weave performance artworks into public spaces, as well as everyday forms of performances in 1980s Singapore. Namely, the focus is on the moments of improvisation by the Art Commandos in both the performances as well as the organization of these performances. I look at how these moments of improvisation and structures I'm looking at my script, so it just went a bit wonky. 1 second. Yes, so I look at how these moments of improvisation were used to navigate and challenge the spaces and structures in Singapore that sought to exclude performance artwork. But it should be noted that the marginalization that I'm discussing and that is faced by performance artists in the 1980s is unlike that of what happened in the 1990s and today, a period when performances were a lot more heavily regulated and censored. This is not to say that there was no censorship. What I am more concerned with, but only that it existed to a smaller extent. So this will be made clearer as I talk you through Art Commandos. So what I'm more concerned with is looking at how performance art was performing against a fixed definition of what art and performances are, which included a fundamental lack of understanding of what performance art even is by the Singaporean government and the public. So I chose this topic as it spans many research areas that I have been overlooked. The first is public performances, which is lacking not just in terms of scholarship on Singapore, but generally. There's also a lack of study on arts festival in Singapore, even though it has been mainstay in the city-state since the 1980s or even earlier. The scholarship available is also more descriptive than analytical. Additionally, compared to the art that came before and after, the scholarship on art from 1980s Singapore is still lacking in terms of performance art and art collectives. Most of the exhibitions and writings on them have been about the artist village. Several artists I've spoken to, however, have noted that there was a burgeoning performance art scene even before the 1990s and the establishment of the artist village. Lastly, improvisation has been overlooked even though it is ubiquitous in and with performances, including performance artworks and everyday forms of performances. Most of the research on improvisation that I've encountered is actually from dance studies, which I've used to help formulate the theoretical framework for this paper. So my starting framework is Roncier's writing on politics and aesthetics, as well as writings on improvisation by several other scholars. I expect that this will continue to evolve as I continue with my research. Essentially, I'll examine how Art Commandos created a sphere of appearance where performance art and artists can be visible in ways that were denied to them in 1980s Singapore. So this sounds a lot more complex than it actually is, but basically a sphere of appearance is the system that determines what can be perceived by our senses, determining who and what is excluded and included from the common sensory world, In other words, who and what is perceivable in society. And I chose to focus on the improvisational strategies of Art Commandos, as I believe that the performances of improvisation is effective in creating a new sphere of appearance where those who are commonly excluded from our common sensory world can be included. Don't worry, this will be made clearer when I share some of my analysis with you. But first, let me define improvisation in this study for you. Don't worry, I'm not going to read out the whole definition. What I wanted to do is to point out the three important points that I feel aptly defines improvisation. So they are that improvisation is always in the making, is generative, and relational. But before I begin my analysis, let me first set the stage by detailing what the art scene was like in 1988. And I'll do this while showing you some more photos of Art Commandos. So this is actually based on my interviews with several performance artists, as well as other arts practitioners who were active during the 1980s and 1990s. Hopefully, this will give you a clearer idea about why Art Commandos is an important performance artwork, and the 1980s, a significant period to study in Singapore art history. So based on my interview, there were relatively fewer regulations of the arts than there are now. This does not apply only to public and state-controlled spaces like museums and universities, but also private ones, including shopping malls, which used to house many exhibitions and art groups. Sadly, this openness to and the publicness of performance art did not last. In the following decade, the art form became much more regulated due to several controversial performance artworks created in the 1990s, including Vincent Liao's The Artist's Urine in 1993 and Joseph Ng's Brother Cane in 1993 to 1994. At the same time, art became increasingly institutionalized in the next decade, exemplified by the founding of the National Arts Council. As a result, there were many new regulations around performances, including the need to submit scripts for vetting for all public performances, as well as a 10-year ban on public funding to performance artwork because of the above-mentioned performance artworks. So this, I believe, would explain why there aren't as many performance artworks and events like Art Commandos. So according to the artists, this lack of regulation might have come about because the government did not have an awareness and understanding of performance art yet, an art form that the government would later refer to as scriptless performances. By the 1990s, again because of the controversial performances, the government was forced to define what performance artwork is, particularly due to the public backlash towards these performances, which made headlines for being immoral. It's because of these performances, I believe, that the performance artwork started to be perceived and defined by the city-state as being antagonistic to their own goals, something that a perception that the government did not have in the 1980s. So next, I will share with you some of my findings and analysis that I have made. It's unsurprising that there is a lack of understanding and awareness of Art Commandos and other performance artworks in the 1980s, and that they seem foreign and out of place, as performance art was first theorized and institutionalized by the Euro-American art world that also wrote the first canon of performance art, which unsurprisingly included only artists from the West, with the inclusion of some Japanese artists. But this is not to say that performance art did not exist outside of Europe or the US. It's just that performance art, specifically how we understand, study, and talk about it today, seemingly only emerged in Singapore in the 1980s, as that is when most of the performance artists, critics, bureaucrats, and other arts practitioners started to learn and adapt the same visual and discursive vocabulary as the performance art form conceived in the West. But a study of Art Commandos shows us just how local performance artworks actually are. This is not just because of the familiar symbols and motifs that Art Commandos employed in their performances. What demonstrates the local nature of the work more clearly instead is the act of improvisation. So Gary Peters explains that an act of improvisation is not just a question of remembering at the last moment the possibilities made available by the countless generations of codes and rules, but rather of making aesthetic judgments that bring into conjunction the individual act and the universal communicative force, subjective feeling, and common sense. So in other words, it can be seen as an embodied form of pre-knowledge. Improvisation also requires the performance body to be open and receptive so that it can respond to the environment that it is in. This includes not only the infrastructures and prosthetics supporting or impeding the performance, but the actions and reactions of viewers as well. So according to Zhu, one of the key moments in Art Commandos is when two policemen approached them while they were performing on Orchard Road. The police confronted them and asked them what they were doing, and they simply replied by saying that it was for the arts festival. The policemen did not ask any follow-up questions and allowed them to proceed. So this is a key moment in Art Commandos, as it was an unscripted encounter with the state, which had the power to stop them from continuing their performance. But through their embodied knowledge and experience of dealing with the state, they know that their performance would be sanctioned by the 1980s government, who was keen to bring art to public spaces in Singapore. This encounter is also memorable, as it would be unimaginable today. It is, for instance, illegal to perform publicly without a police license. Again, what this demonstrates is that improvisation is highly contextual, which is basically my long-winded way of suggesting that all performances, particularly performance of improvisation, are really local. Also, just to clarify, so Art Commandos did not have a police license. So they were basically an event under a festival fringe, but then they did not have to submit any scripts to the government for vetting. They had quite a lot of freedom to choose where they wanted to perform and also where they, also what they wanted to perform. Okay, so next, when I first encountered the photographs of Art Commandos, it reminded me of performances of street protests. This is not only due to its name, but also because most of the other performance artworks that I encountered from the same period were created and performed in private spaces for a close audience of other practitioners and friends. So to the best of my knowledge, not many of them that came before and after it was as public as Art Commandos. As Jack Santino rightly explains, the very act of taking the streets is an act of exerting power. For this reason, such actions are closely regulated and met with resistance from above. Conversely, when a public space is dedicated to celebrating a normative institution, this too is an enactment of political power in public. Okay, but I soon realized that Art Commandos was not at all created to be confrontational or with political intentions. According to Zhu, Art Commandos was intended instead as a space that allowed the students to experiment, learn, and have fun in ways that were denied to them in the art school. According to the artists I've interviewed, art was taught in a very traditional manner. It was, for example, still segregated very clearly according to the medium you are specializing in. If you're a painter, you're a painter. If you're a sculptor, you're a sculptor. And back then, there wasn't this concept of a performance artist yet. In other words, it was created as a space for the students to experiment and to collaborate in ways that they could not in public institutions. But it's worth noting that this collaborative way of creating art was not new or unique to Art Commandos. Instead, according to my interviews, the art students in Singapore have always had the practice of working collaboratively. What Art Commandos did instead was to help visualize this collaborative form of art making. More accurately, it helped to visualize and create a microcosm of the relational and pedagogical space that performance artworks in Singapore were typically created in. So according to Zhu, this is why he did not have a fixed program or set goals for Art Commandos, as it was never intended to be a showcase of a finished performance. Rather, it's a space for and a showcase of the spontaneous and organic interactions and relations formed by the students. So this not only challenged traditional understandings of art, but festivals itself, which are traditionally focused on a finished object or performances, as well as based on scripted behaviors like customs. Of course, that is not to say that the Art Commandos did not include any form of normative performances and behaviors. Instead, rather than following them ritualistically, they were used by the students as a cultural resource to be dissected, experimented, and played with. So generally, my observation of performance artworks produced in Singapore during that period is that, like Art Commandos, they're often created from and out of artists coming together to workshop their performances and, more importantly, to just hang out and have fun. A lot of performance artworks, hence, are unscripted and even unplanned. They are based on as well as evolve from the artist's interactions with and feedback from the others present. What Art Commandos show us then is another way of creating art that has always existed in Singapore. One focused on improvisation, collaboration, and play rather than the mastery of a specific skill. So paradoxically, the success of Art Commandos can be seen in this complaint letter. So this disgruntled member of the public commented that Art Commandos showed that there's this trend of anything goes in the name of art and that performance has no content. The member of, so they go on to say that the lack of commitment and organization was further reflected by the haphazard program, which included a poetry recitation and on-the-spot children drawing session, all of which point to a successful process-oriented performance event that was focused on creating a space for participants to play. But I believe that the critic also demonstrates how performances that are created to be transformative can actually work towards sustaining the dominant structures within Singapore society. The complaint letter, for instance, demonstrates how Art Commandos solidified the narrow definition of performances for some viewers. Additionally, the liminal nature of festivals is productive to the state as it allows for the temporary suspension of norms, allowing participants to express themselves in ways that they are not normally allowed to, but in a controlled and temporary fashion. These norms, however, are often expected to be safely returned to once the festival concludes. As many scholars have argued, what happens as a result is that citizens would become more tolerant of normative rules. This, I believe, is an important reason why the Singapore government still actively invests in and organizes festivals. The 1980s was also a period when Singapore's economy blossomed. Resultantly, the government shifted its economic policies towards moving the country's economy towards the service sector, as well as branding Singapore not merely as a consumer of culture, but a producer as well. This will explain the surge in investments and interest by the 1980s government in performance events, festivals, as well as performance festivals, as it was productive to both the economic goals of the government and the city's aim to be seen as a cosmopolitan one. But this is something I believe that performers were keenly aware of. Interestingly, although some of the artists I've spoken to might use their performance to protest against the commodification and marketization of art today, I get the sense that they did not feel the same then, that their performances were and should be in opposition to the economic goals and development of 1980s Singapore. So what this demonstrates is that there's an interesting development and change in how artists work for, with, and against the market throughout Singapore's history. Which brings me to my next section, which outlines the next steps for this project. So as I continue with my research, this is an area where I would like to explore more, how artists contributed towards the economic growth and goals of the government, and the strategies that they adopted to prevent themselves and their works from being co-opted. In addition to exploring the relationships between performance art and the economy, I also hope to interview more participants of Art Commandos to uncover more moments of improvisation. I would also like to do some comparative analysis between Art Commandos and other performance artworks produced during that period to not only better contextualize Art Commandos, but 1980s Singapore as well. So with that, I end my presentation. Thank you once again for being such a wonderful audience, and I look forward to your questions and feedback. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Wei Hao. And as discussed, we have Shumei Huang from the Graduate Institute of Building and Planning of the National Taiwan University. This is the other NTU. And I can't think of anyone better to be the discussant because Shumei is intimately familiar with public spaces and memory. Shumei, take it away.
Thank you, Ian, for the kind words. I'm honored to be the discussant, but I'm also a bit nervous because I think I know little about the art thing. But I do find great joy attending to the presentation and it's really interesting ongoing work. I am a scholar in urban studies and memory studies by training. So it's really, I'm really happy to see this presentation, which reminds us how art and art festival could be before it was largely commercialized or worse still instrumentalized by the nation states or city states as we are seeing today. So nowadays we have like most major cities around the world are hosting at least one kind of art festival at some time, and most of them were attended by tourists. But as we can see from the presentation tonight, um, it was when it was in the 80s in Singapore. It was mainly that these young artists were doing that for themselves to explore the possibility. And at the same time, providing inspiration for those who attended. And I do wonder, like, I think we can hardly actually have this kind of quality and values from those very popular art festival around the world. And so there's an issue. There's an issue of creation and then appropriation. And oftentimes it is the states, the control, hiding in behind institution to appropriate these really valuable creative activities. Um, and on that note, I think this work also touches upon this important issue of public space and the public. I think in the 21st century, unfortunately, we are so used to being consumers, consumers of public space, like waiting for the city, for the state to provide us public space. But look at those things from the 80s in Singapore. It does remind us actually what's more important is the public. And only when the artists and attendees who were actively engaging themselves in those activities, or we can maybe argue that is actually a process of remaking the city, then we were able to see the existence of the public who made or enable public space. In other words, public space are not something endurable or stable lying out there. It actually requires the public to sustain it. So I think this case interestingly demonstrates that moment. Of course, as a person based in Taiwan, it also I cannot but think about the 80s in Taiwan. I was actually quite young in the 80s, so for me, I almost that retrospectively learn and admire that period when, of course, it was an important political moment for Taiwan because it was the lifting of martial law, occurred in 1987. Yeah, so there was lots of happening, energy and also crisis, all happening at the same time. In 2022, actually, in the Taipei Museum of Fine Art, there was an exhibition on the 80s. In Mandarin, it's called 狂八零, the wild 80s. So actually, I saw a possibility to draw some parallels across places. And I also know this could be the case for South Korea too. Seoul City, I think, at that time. So I think there's a lot of potential. After we have finished this PhD project, I think there's a lot more for you to do. I think, of course, political. I don't want to just like out of a sudden bring this project into the context of political history. Still, I think it can be a kind of interdisciplinary project that bridge across politics and art history. It also happens that behavioral arts seemingly was introduced to East Asia during that time. At least that's the case for Taiwan. So we saw many experiments of that in that so-called wild 80s. So I don't know if that is also the case for Singapore, but I do think art concepts like behavioral arts actually provides a useful frame for young people, young spirits, young bodies in East Asia to experiment with situated political acts territorially, spatially, and with these, there could be possibility for a kind of relational identities that can even go beyond young artists to reach the public. And I think this resonates a lot with the notion of improvisation or liminalities that you talk about. I also adopted liminality by Victor Turner as a great anthropologist, if I were to understand urban activism in Taiwan and also in Hong Kong. And I do think in this context, then street actually has a crucial role, a critical role in the discussion. Otherwise, we would not, like even until today, when we say let's take it to the street, it's actually an expression of resistance or unsatisfaction, and therefore there is willingness to change or to create together. And I don't want to go on forever, but I do want to tie this with some points you make toward the end. So Wei Hao actually talks about a really interesting notion that I want to hear a bit more about. You talk about pre-knowledge, embodied form of pre-knowledge. I think this is the first time I read this wording, a pre-knowledge in this context. So I'm quite curious. Wonder if you may elaborate that a bit. And I am also I'm also curious about how this case was received. Of course, you already showed us some examples of those commentary published in the newspaper, and they were criticized. But I wonder, if there is a way to go beyond those commentary. Yes, they are strong. They may be quite representative, but I'm just curious, methodologically speaking, is there a way for you to reach, to talk to those who happen to be part of the audience, and who did get a chance to to negotiate boundaries or identities through that processes. I know this might be too demanding because I do think it would be be challenging to do this research after almost 4 decades. But I'm just wondering if you have thought of any possibility. Yeah, so I think this is all I have for now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Shumei. So before we start with the Q&A, I do also encourage members of the audience to put your questions in the chat, and I'll read them out. But yeah, before we start with that, do you have any quick responses to Shumei, Wei Hao?
Yes, thank you so much for that. That was really, really amazing. So just to quickly respond to two of your points. So this embodied pre-knowledge, right, is something that I came across when I was doing this research, and it was used in one of the dance studies paper. And I found it really interesting as well. And it captures a lot of important points in that kind of short description. So how I understand this, what embodied pre-knowledge is basically like a corporeal kind of knowledge. Corporeal in the sense that it is biological. You know, there are some ways that our body react intuitively, instinctively, but also reacting to the norms that shape the spaces, particularly public spaces, right? Because if you think of it as a stage, there are many different prosthetics and like there are different structures that form this stage that we perform on. And also, of course, like customary behaviors that we've been socialized since we were young. So all of this play a part in the moment of improvisation. So that's why I feel that improvisation is such a rich source of what you call rich source of pre-knowledge. Yeah. And also related to what you say about methodology, yeah, I acknowledge and I'm very aware that right now I think most of the reading comes from the photos and my interview with Gilles. But what I hope to do in the future is to reach out to more people. So for instance, the participants, some of them continue being artists, some of them didn't. So I have to go and like hunt them down. And of course, it'd be amazing to be able to get thoughts from the audience as well. I think this ties into one of the earlier things you mentioned, the idea of memory, because this project was created like 4 decades ago. And how we perceive public spaces today and back then is so different as well. And this will definitely kind of like transform their memories and perception of Art Commandos in a very interesting manner. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks. So as we look for questions to come in, I do have one issue that I hope that perhaps Wei Hao can help everyone clarify. We've talked a lot tonight about public spaces. We've talked a lot about the public. So what to you, is the public? What makes a space public? I think those are some of the fundamental issues that perhaps it would be good to sort of touch on briefly.
That's a very good question. Yeah, admittedly, it's one of those terms that I take for granted. Like public is like seemingly almost intuitive, but I guess to me, what is very important for public space is access, like physical access, for your body to be able to embody the space, to be present. And I think for me, living and growing up in Singapore, public also means something very different as well. It also means a lack of access, because a lot of our spaces are shaped by different kind of regulations and customary behaviors, which I think is what drew me to study Art Commandos, because it's a performance that I can't imagine happening today. So I wanted to see how they negotiate this kind of lack of access to their body, but through the studying of this through the study of Art Commandos, I realized that the idea of public spaces has changed so much over the 4 decades that like what Professor Shume has said, it's a space that needs to be continually reappropriated and and being continually created into kind of new form of public space. So that is something that I realized as well, that public space is not something that is static, but it's something that's evolving and transforming with our performances and how we interact with the public space. Yeah.
Okay, so there's just one other thing I'd like to push you on, because
Yes.
I guess everyone here is well, with the exception of me probably, doesn't quite remember the 80s as much. So you talked a lot about how the public space is different from the 80s as opposed to what it is today. Can you give
Yeah.
a sense for people what do you find the contrast to be?
So of course I have to clarify that I don't have like
Yes,
personal
I know
like
you have
lived
no
experiences. Yeah.
yes, I do, you
So
don't.
so it's based on kind of my the picture that I formed from kind of my research, and particularly from speaking with the artists who were performing then. And also I'm speaking more specifically about uh public spaces relationship with performance artworks. So my interpretation is that there were a lot less regulations. I think this is not so much only because like the government was so-called more open-minded, but one important point that I've raised is that there were a lot less bureaucratic. Art was a lot less institutionalized. I don't need just art, but culture in general. So there wasn't as many like kinds of fixed definitions that performers had to fall within that determine what can be considered public performance and what it couldn't. So back then it was a lot more experimental because you could do whatever you wanted to. And I think this lack of clear definition of what performance is allowed performance to be what we perceive today as a lot more public. Yeah.
Right now, that's fascinating, because I think to many people today, when you think about spaces that are visible
Hmm.
without hindrance, I mean, the thought is you need a license, you need
Hmm.
some sort of state approval. So in fact, I think it's a bit surprising that in the 80s, when people imagined Singapore to be a more tightly controlled space,
Yeah.
actually, right, that wasn't necessary. I mean, you think about busking today. Another friend of
Yeah.
mine
Yeah.
just went and got his busking license, right? But
Yeah.
it seemed like people could just do that. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Because
so
from yeah.
go
Oh
ahead.
no, I just wanted to give more details about Art Commandos to show just how fascinating it is, because like they perform wherever they wanted to, and they wanted to use the space at St. Joseph Institute for kind of their final operation. And the head of the festival, Jessica Leo, just got permission for them, and they managed to do it. There wasn't much paperwork. There wasn't much like kind of like application at all. And I think part of it also comes from the fact that a lot of it back then there was a lot more private patronage. Like I think a lot of the funding from this project came from Mobil Oil, which is like Exxon Mobil today. Yeah. But right now, most of the festivals are very, very, very heavily funded by the government. So there is a way for them to kind of determine what should be public performance and what shouldn't, because there are multiple definitions that performances can fall within. Yeah.
Great. I've got two questions from Nini Chang, which I think are really great ones that I think really helps us think about your
Yeah.
project. One, right, is that the spatial practice of street art action
Mm.
is more important in your paper. So, is there some sense that the notion of gender, does that have any place in this performance? That's the first one, the question of gender.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, from the photos you showed, I mean, there seems to be some variation in gender. So if you could talk about that,
Yeah,
that'd be
yeah, yeah.
great. The second point is that you talked about how this is a guerrilla type of art, right? Is there, and I guess me asked if there's a comparative vision of art guerrilla, right? So I guess going back to what Shumei had mentioned, right? You see other flowering of performance art across the region, right, at around the
Mm.
same time. So how do you contextualize that, right? Do you see the Art Commandos as being reflective of a movement that we might see in Taiwan or Hong Kong or Korea or anywhere else, or the Philippines, another place that was opening up in the 80s, or if even these movements might have some connections and influence on art in Singapore. Because we do know, at least in terms of theatre, another Singaporean scholar based in Taiwan, Wao Guan Lim, has worked on theatre and talks about the connections between people like Guo Baokun and Danny Yeoh, etc. Right, that is cross-regional. So yeah, the cross-regional influences, that'd be great to talk about. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the questions. So I'll address the part about the cross-regional references first. So this is based on my understanding of performance art in Singapore and China. I think both countries in the 1970s and 1980s started seeing kind of like economic modernization, like modernization not just in the sense that there was economic growth, but also it became more and more attuned with the kind of like dominant economic model of its time. And this, of course, affected the art market as well. Like before the 1980s and 1990s, there wasn't really this idea of an art market. This is part of the neoliberal kind of economic model, right? But so the ideas of like professional artists started developing and art being able to be commodified and sold. So what I realized is that a lot of the performance artists that emerged during that time are actually resource poor artists, but they had access to their bodies. So this is speaking specifically to China and Singapore. Like for instance, a lot of the canonical performance artists were students in the 80s and 90s. So they did not have access to a lot of the other like kind of like materials that you need for say other art forms, or they did not have the same platform as well. And for in China, there was a lot of the performance artists actually lived in a lot of like abject poverty, but they were creating art because this was like the body is a resource that everyone has access to. So I think this could be one of the reasons why there is this kind of cross-regional influence, because a lot of the East Asian countries have like kind of similar economic development. Of course, I'm saying this in a very broad stroke. Yeah. And also there is the time where I think there was a delay in the kind of import of this like Euro-American kind of idea of performance art as well. Like in China, this was after 78, there was, when Deng Xiaoping took over, there started to be like kind of like opening, after 76, sorry, there can be opening up, and like, so there was this import of these ideas. Whereas in Singapore, it's something that I actually want to explore more, why there was this kind of like almost like 10, 20-year delay in like the kind of import idea. I don't exactly know why, yeah. But there is another parallel that I guess is worth exploring as well. And to answer the question regarding gender, right? Embarrassingly, that is something that I've not thought about yet, but it's definitely something that it's always on my mind, because one of my theoretical focus is on like queer studies, so gender plays a very big part. But for this project, I have yet to consider the ideas and concept of gender. So I don't have a very good answer for that. I'm so sorry.
No, that's fine. But actually, I mean, you seem to have thought about it somewhat, maybe not as deeply as you'd like. So what's your intuition? What's your intuition about how gender plays into the Art Commandos and street art in Singapore in the 80s?
I think in the 1980s, right? I mean, I'm not saying that it's a lot better now, but it was a very kind of male-dominated art scene. Like it was still a lot of the idea of the great man theory. Like we have this person who started this art form, this person who started this art school. So a lot of like there wasn't much mention of like female artists at all. And it was only in the 1980s that embarrassingly like more female artists emerged. And a lot of times it's through these kind of like art collectives and collaborative platforms that that allowed them to emerge. So that could be something very interesting to explore, like how a more kind of collaborative form of art making allowed more interesting and interesting gender dynamics to emerge. Yeah, but I know it's not a good look, like me as a cis male not being able to really answer about gender. But it's just for this project that I've yet to really give a deep thought about it. So I don't want to also like kind of like make very uneducated kind of suggestions as well.
All right. Okay, so I see Zihan has a bunch of comments for you. Zihan, actually, why don't you, if you can, why don't you turn on your video and just sort of, yeah, you can explain your questions, your comments, but briefly, please.
Hello. Yeah, thanks for the really
Hello.
interesting and productive study of a period that I'm not particularly aware of, and I think most people aren't. My main question is, a lot of the resources that survive are constructed by people who have a vested interest in the incident itself, like Jews. So a lot of the historical records that survive and the photos and the memories are implicated, as in they're not possibly ever neutral, but they're also selectively remembered. So how do we approach these accounts while being very critical of the positionality of these archival materials? And the fact that certain things are completely absent, like they're not remembered by the state, they're probably not remembered even by the participants, you know. And to approach these archival materials without romanticization, because that's also a tendency and danger that I did with approaching race archive.
No, that's a really Sorry.
No, I was just saying, surely you just the Straits Times is the paper of record, and they will unequivocally record everything without fear or favor, right? Okay. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
No, that was a very good point, because when I started out as a kind of like I actually looked at the 1990s performance art scene with a very rose-tinted lens when I first started my examination, my research into it. But when I started speaking to artists, they constantly also reminded me, don't romanticize the artist village. Don't romanticize 1980s. It was something that Zhu also brought up while we were discussing this as well, which is why I wanted to also showcase that this kind of collaborative way of creating performance artwork was not unique to Art Commandos. It's something that always existed within like the Singapore art scene. It's something that the art students themselves is a very common practice amongst them. But also, that being said, it's something that I admit is very challenging because of the kind of like lack of access to certain resources. The ones that endured, like Zihan said, are being privileged by certain actors, like privileged by the archivist, privileged by the artist, or privileged by the state. So the best thing I can do is to try to kind of compare all these different, try to accumulate and then compare all these different sources, but at the same time always be very reflexive about the subjectivity in these resources, as well as my own subjectivity as like someone studying it in 2024, who grew up in a different kind of political and art climate. That like, but which is the reason why I love studying performance, because it's always up for different interpretation. Like all performance documentation is a re-performance that is open to another kind of interpretation. So that is something that I want readers to also acknowledge when they kind of read my or listen to my interpretation of the artwork as well. Yeah.
Great. So let's see if there are any questions. All right. If not, then I don't know. Shumei, do you have any sort of other sort of thoughts that might have come to you as you sort of gone through this discussion with us?
Yeah,
I didn't mean
maybe
to put you
not
on
very. Just very briefly, responding to earlier, we was saying that there might be a time lag between how art was transforming in Europe or in the US and then in East Asia. But I think in the case of Taiwan, we do actually receive maybe a lot more influences from Japan, for example. So actually, in the 80s, there was a certain Enkoku Buto group. They came to Taiwan and they actually brought quite long-lasting influence upon a generation of performance artists, and then through Taiwan to Hong Kong. So at least in the case of Taiwan, there were interreferencing and interaction or collaboration among Japan, Taiwan, and Hong Kong in theater too. So 镜面20面体 and those theater groups, experimental theater groups in Taiwan. I was actually surprised because I didn't know that history until I saw the exhibition 2 years ago. So I do think this kind of research is really important, and it can not only to fill the gap of our history, but I think it reminds us, it sort of can renew our imaginary of cultural geography or even political geography. I'm saying this because I'm in urban studies, urban geographers. But I do think it can. I'm looking forward to see how finalizing this project and also providing inspiration across disciplines.
Wei Hao, before I'm gonna hand it to you to finish up. But I think the thing that sort of is floating around here is, so for the Art Commandos, where did they draw inspiration from? Was it completely just sort of self-creation? In your interviews with them, in your looking at the archival material, was there some reference to some inspiration, some performance elsewhere, some interaction? I think that would be good to have to sort of locate, right, where the Art Commandos are drawing their ideas from. Yeah. But yeah, take it away. You can finish up our conversation. You have the last word since you're the presenter.
Oh no, yeah, that just a very good point. I think that will help also to link maybe to more of like the regional and the cross-cultural kind of influences that were flowing around that we've been discussing during the final section. Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for attending and thank you so much for your wonderful feedback and questions. Yeah, this has been a very amazing opportunity and experience. And yeah, I have a lot to think about to continue developing this project. So it's been very productive and fruitful.
Great. Thank you so much, Wei Hao, and thank you so much, Shumei. I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us.
Pleasure.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us this evening. And I hope you've taken something away from this. I really look forward to seeing you all again for our next Junior Scholar seminar. So do stay tuned. And for those of you who want to watch this again, or your friends who might be interested but missed it because of the timing, all this will be uploaded online on the Academia SG website and also our Facebook. So do keep a lookout for that. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening, and thank you, Shumei and Wei Hao again.